How Helen hated sad funeral ceremonies. Well, of course, no one asked her permission to live or go beyond the border, to a place from which no one could return. And now, as soon as she saw the inscription Julia, neighbor on the smartphone screen, her heart sank with an unpleasant feeling. Helen, hello baby. It's on Julia who worries. Sorry to bring you bad news this morning, but your father's phone isn't answering. So I have to bring grief down on you. George died. I was going to work and saw him sitting in an apple tree. I look, he seems to be doing something, half turning towards the street. Well, I wave to him and say, good morning. I ask what he was doing early in the morning, and George showed zero emotion to me, didn't even move. Although you know that my voice is loud, it's impossible not to hear. I went up to George, but he wasn't breathing. While I'm sitting here on the porch, I called all the necessary services, except for the ritual. It's not for me to decide how to see off George, but to be honest, I need to go to work. Would you come? Testedly responded in a hoarse voice. Of course, Aunt Julia, I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The sad news that her paternal grandfather, the always cheerful and cheerful George, had overcome the last milestone came as a real shock to Helen. We have to go, of course, organize everything, call everyone from grandfather's phone book. However, I wanted to convince myself that this conversation with my neighbor about my grandfather was just a bad dream. Now all you need to do is open your eyelids wide and look at the call history on your smartphone and make sure that there was no call. Unfortunately, this hope was not justified, and there really was a call from Aunt Valia. And the girl did everything possible to quickly get to her grandfather's house, located within the city, but in the so-called private sector. Having already got into the taxi car that had arrived on call, Helen asked her boss for a day off, then had a short conversation with her office colleague, explaining where the documents were, which, as luck would have it, the customers were supposed to come for today. The girl never dared to make the most difficult call. How to inform your father and mother, who have flown away on vacation to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary, that they urgently need to return to say goodbye to grandfather George. Helen became sad. How unexpectedly this tragedy happened. Just the day before yesterday, she called her grandfather. He said that he was waiting for a visit and asked him to come quickly. Not for the sake of caring for a small garden, but to talk on some issue, to seek it. Helen promised to be there on the weekend that had recently flown by. She could have easily visited her grandfather, but she got a little sick, postponed the visit, called and apologized. They chatted for a bit about nothing. Grandfather George recalled the method that his wife Kristen and grandmother Helen always used. The girl listened that she needed to brew special herbs, wait until the infusion cooled to a pleasant warmth, stir a spoonful of honey in a glass of healing liquid, drink it, and lie down under the blanket. She promised that she would undergo intensive treatment and then visit him. And in the first month of autumn, when she had a vacation scheduled, the girl promised to stay with him for at least a week. Lord, how embarrassing. Now Helen was ashamed that she was going to wait for her vacation. After all, by public transport with transfers, you could get to grandfather in 45 minutes. When there were no traffic jams on the roads, you could even after work go not home, but to a loved one who had been incredibly bored alone for a little over a year. When over it was uneasy that she was a free girl and could easily keep a lonely grandfather company. It would be quite possible to go to work and back by taxi. Of course, it would be more expensive than using public transport, but it would be quick and comfortable. Alternatively, you could simply leave the house a little earlier in order to walk to the transport stop from which the tram of the required route departs. Everything could absolutely be resolved, sorted out somehow. But he didn't have the insight to understand that Grandpa George needed care and supervision, and his requests to come were not just the whim of a bored elderly man. Helen was tormented by a painful feeling of shame, and sighing, she tried to call her parents. However, both Mom and Dad's numbers were out of network coverage. The girl had to send a letter by email, hoping that the unpleasant news would be read not too late. While solving troubles and questions, the time on the way to my grandfather's house flew by unnoticed. Helen got out of the taxi and, listening to Aunt Valia's sympathetic remarks, felt real grief falling on her. The neighbor hugged the girl who arrived, asked her to hold on, and ran to work. Helen looked at her grandfather and kept expecting that now he would get up, stretch, and invite her to a tea party in the house or in the gazebo entwined with grapes. However, no miracle happened. Services, which arrived in response to a call from a neighbor, began another whirlwind of sad affairs associated with the passing of the older generation. The lady doctor confirmed the death of my grandfather, presumably from a heart attack. She recommended funeral agencies to the girl and explained that there were specialists working there who could organize mourning procedures with the most due respect for the deceased and sympathy for his relatives. Helen listened to the advice and tried with all her might to hold back bitter tears of despair. Only by lunchtime the girl was left alone. Helen entered her grandfather's house and burst into tears when she saw the phone on the table, which he apparently forgot on his last earthly morning. Probably if he had a cell phone, he would be able to call somewhere and ask for help. But it was impossible to change the past. Everything turned out the way it did. The girl discovered the cash, which her grandfather George and grandmother Kristen told her about shortly after she came of age. The man then tilted the rug hanging over the bed, gently pressed on one of the wooden panels, then with a slight movement moved it to the side. The surprised girl saw a deep vertical niche. Grandfather explained, "Here, granddaughter, Speta and I are slowly putting money here so that it won't be a burden to anyone. You'll bury us with this money." Helen remembered how she began to grumble at her grandparents. She said that it was too early for them to think about such a topic. She assured that they would still have the opportunity to babysit their great-grandchildren. "No, my dear, that won't do. First, I will have to consider approve, and then help raise the kids. Mom and Dad always have no time." Granny, patting her smiling granddaughter on the head, quietly objected. "Helen, we're not asking you whether it's too early for us to think about our last journey in this world or not. Just showing you so you know, just in case. After all, George already has an anniversary this year, 70 years old, and I'm not much younger. Alas, at that age anything can happen. Your parents, of course, also know about this hiding place. But you never know, maybe they'll be wary or start being modest." Grandfather George supported his wife. "Now, we don't want to be a burden to you. So let's end the conversation." The grandmother hastened to change the topic and began to talk about the amusements of the selected kitten, simply nicknamed the man. Now, 6 years after this conversation, the skinny kid has turned into a well-fed, long, and independent, handsome man. The owner's departure was a real shock for the animal, and he even lost his excellent appetite for several days. However, grandfather George managed to pull the cat out of this state, and now this mission fell to Helen. It seemed to the girl that the orphan cat understood everything, and that's why he curled up on his grandfather's bed and didn't even react to the sound of the refrigerator door opening. The agencies recommended by our employee were indeed professional. A serious man suggested that Helen hold a farewell not at home, but in a special ritual hall at the cemetery. Getting there is much easier than here in the private sector, and even though the house is big, there will still be fuss, unnecessary fuss. The room there is convenient and comfortable. Everyone will be able to say goodbye calmly and without the crush that usually accompanies the removal of a body from an apartment or house. Everything will be both touching and civilized. Besides, understand, it will save you a lot of problems. The offer seemed reasonable to Helen, but she had to spend not only her meager savings but also her grandfather's stash to pay for funeral services. The girl did everything that was necessary. As if being in a state of sleep, she kept waiting for her parents to arrive, or at least answer the email, but in vain. The girl contacted the hotel where they had booked a room, but as we managed to understand from the answer in broken Russian, Mr. and Mrs. Hurd did not move in. They explained that they had decided to change plans a little. Helen was worried about her parents, but she couldn't do anything. Now clods of earth began to fall on the lid of grandfather George's coffin, but neither his son nor his daughter-in-law appeared. Words of condolences and sympathy were received by Helen, who had to listen to the lamentations of distant relatives who came to see the old man off on his last journey. Some spoke bluntly about the thoughtless son and daughter-in-law who did not appear at the mournful event. The girl defended her parents as best she could, and the guardians of other people's morality fell silent for a while, turning the conversation to other topics. Gradually, only relatives and closest neighbors remained at the funeral table, organized in a small cafe. Helen, who last saw most of them a little less than a year ago at farewell to grandmother Sveta, could hardly endure all the questions. She wanted to run away from the cafe as soon as possible, but she had to fulfill her granddaughter's duty to the very end. From time to time, she herself, along with the waiters, took out dirty dishes and brought funeral treats, just so as not to sit at the table listening to the conversations of those gathered growing louder. Quite by chance, Helen, While serving another portion of pies, overheard part of the conversation between Aunt Valia and grandfather's cousin Stepan. George sometimes communicated with this apple tree like a person. I told him, even when Kristen was alive, that this useless tree needs to be cut down. It has long grown higher than the roof of the house, and apples cannot be easily obtained. Kristen, Kingdom of Heaven. She kept swearing that this tree was of little use. It would bear fruit for a year so that you were tired of growing the harvest. Then it wouldn't bear a single fruit. Everything was threatened to be cut down. Only George, blessed to his memory, always stood up to defend the apple tree, nodding, and Julia agreed with the interlocutor. What you say is true. George's passion for this old apple tree also seems strange to me. Well, if only the plot was about a hectare, then it would seem that the place wouldn't be a problem. But it's simply stupid to leave such a huge tree in such a small snippet of conversation, made Helen think. Indeed, in fact, grandfather treated this apple tree as if it were a living person. The girl often saw him affectionately stroking the bark of a tree as he passed by. Once as a child, Helen, deciding to play, climbed onto a branch, which broke off under her. And grandfather George, entrusting his granddaughter to the care of his wife, began to treat the wound of the tree himself, recently. After the death of grandmother Kristen, my grandfather even preferred to relax alone under the crown of an apple tree, rather than in a specially built gazebo entwined with grapes. Thoughts from the mysterious apple tree that George had so highlighted briefly receded to sad worries. The relatives were the last to leave the rented hall, and Stepan reminded Helen, no, someone should definitely spend the night in George's house until 40. You won't be scared alone until your parents show up. Maybe send someone with you. At least take Mylena, my youngest daughter, with you. She has nothing to do at home anyway. Her husband is on a business trip. You can sit and chat. Looking at her, she saw the face of a woman who clearly had her own plans for the evening and completely lacked the desire to spend the night somewhere in an unfamiliar place. Helen hastened to refuse. But thank you, but I really can handle it myself. After all, it's like a sign of my respect for my grandfather. Having said goodbye to everyone, the girl hurried to the public transport stop, since her relatives had to go in completely different directions. As soon as Helen opened the gate of her grandfather's house, she regretted that she had tried to create the image of an independent and strong person. Of course, she's not too young to be afraid of an empty house. But I've already spent several nights here completely alone, so he can handle it. She began to think again about the reason why the tree occupied such an important place in the life of her relative. Thoughtfully, the girl hand-fed the sad cat, but she felt somehow uneasy being in the house, even in the company of a cat. Helen went out into the yard and, obeying an impulse, approached a tree on which small green fruits were hanging high somewhere. A flock of goosebumps ran down her spine when the girl saw scratches on the ground. There was no doubt. Grandfather George left these marks. It became truly creepy when Helen had the crazy idea that the dying man was scratching the ground not in agony but trying to dig something up. The girl went to the barn, took a small garden trowel from there, and returning to the apple tree, began to carefully dig the ground. Almost immediately, the scoop hit something hard. Helen began to dig with the utmost care and soon pulled out from a shallow hole a solid rectangular package, wrapped in a bag and additionally wrapped with tape. Helen had never heard any stories about family heirlooms and was truly shocked. At home, Helen laid an old towel on the table, which had long been asking for a well-deserved rest somewhere in the trash, put her find on it, and carefully opened the package with a kitchen knife, which grandfather always kept sharp. Under the layers of tape in the bag was a metal candy box. The girl, holding her breath, opened it and saw inside not jewelry or money but papers. Under the folded notebook leaves, clearly covered with grandmother's even handwriting, there were envelopes. Judging by the fact that the package was quite modern, with the emblem of a chain supermarket, and the paper was neither damp nor yellowed, Helen concluded that the find had not lain in the ground for very long, thinking that nothing bad would happen if she found out what her grandfather was trying to get before his death. Helen began to study the find. It was clearly written by my grandmother. "My dear George, I'm writing you a note, realizing that I have very little time left in this world, and I don't think I have the right to take this secret with me. Forgive me, George, for many years ago, because of love for you, I committed deception and even a crime. It's hard to admit, but it's necessary. You and I were already married then. They sent my daughter to kindergarten, and I returned to work at the post office. Everything was fine with us. So I envied myself. And then I saw a letter addressed to you. The sender was a certain woman. My heart immediately felt bad. I didn't give you the letter, I secretly read it myself. That's how I found out about your novel. Your sweetheart reported that it was her strict father who arranged your separation back in 1964. He threatened to kill you or put you in jail using his connections. In fact, he left her the only way, to tell you, looking into your eyes, that he doesn't love you at all and doesn't want to see you ever again. The mother tried to stand up for her daughter, but it did not help. The woman was simply beaten by her own husband because she dared to say a word in defiance. I looked at what your father had done and was terribly afraid for you. That's why she said convincingly everything she was told. After this cruel confession, you predictably flared up, packed your things, took an apple tree seedling as a souvenir for your parents and returned. Legsons of a woman in the letter reported that she was pregnant with your child, and to cover up her sin, she was married off without an official signature to some widower with numerous children in a remote settlement that didn't even have a name. I read the letter in the dark, wet with tears, and even began to sympathize with your young beloved. She complained that her family life did not work out. The man with whom she had to live perceived her as a servant. But despite the scandals with relatives, Alina named the girl she was born your daughter in honor of her mother Sophie. The unfortunate young mother found herself literally in slavery. She endured beatings, humiliation, and tirelessly planned her escape. When my daughter began to grow up, Alien became even heavier. The native children of this so-called husband began to mock the girl, and her mother could not say a word in defense. The beatings began immediately. Only 5 years later, Alien still managed to escape from her husband. She did not give details, but because even the letters at this point were blurred from tears spilled on the paper, it was clear it was very difficult. Alien asked that you come to these very settlements for her and her daughter. She wrote that she would be waiting for you. When I read the letter, it was as if I had gone blind and deaf at the same time. I really didn't understand how I should continue to live. Giving you the messages meant losing my family, and our son was only 3 years old. How could I deprive his father with my own hands? How would he grow up without you? I repent. That first letter, I then destroyed it and threw it in the oven. I thought I protected my family. I shouldn't have hoped. Alien continued to send letters. The next one came almost a year later. Apparently, she planned for you to receive news from her and your daughter on your birthday. She asked why you don't answer her. How scared I was then that she would get ready and come to you. The distance is not particularly long, maybe a little more than 300 kilometers or something like that. It turns out that almost next door to us live those who are capable of destroying my life. If I can burn the letters, then the problem with Sophie is more complicated. What am I supposed to do with the woman and child? I started thinking about how I could prevent them from coming to you. I wrote a letter copying your handwriting on your behalf just in case. I promised that I would come as soon as I could. You probably don't even remember how I tried to persuade you to move, but you never agreed. So I lived like on a volcano. I didn't know how to protect my happiness, how to preserve it if you found out the truth about yours. At work, I also didn't take any vacation or sick leave because of this. Then you realized, 5 years later, that only once a year does this woman bother you. I felt a little better. I burned the letters for a long time, several years, and then I felt ashamed. I started hiding them. I knew that there were places in the house that you would never think of getting into. The only thing is, because of my own fears, I couldn't leave my post office and refuse the more promising position. Well, it's okay, I'm used to it. How long did she write to you? But I only saved 10 messages with the last letter that arrived in 1994, and I acted completely meanly. And that she wrote that her health had become completely bad and that she needed medication. And although Sophie tries to support her, there's always not enough money. It's clear. It was such a time then, the whole country was in a fever. She didn't ask for anything for herself. But, of course, I couldn't completely calm down. What if the difficult one brings her to our region? What if she decides to see you? I carefully printed this envelope and returned it with the note the addressee has left. After that, the stream of letters from Alien completely dried up. Why should I have done this before? And I don't understand it myself. There wouldn't be a problem in the first place. And now I don't know what to do with the letters. By right and conscience, you should read them, but not during my lifetime. So, when you find out the bitter story of Ali and your daughter, I will no longer be there. Sorry for being selfish, but I couldn't do otherwise. She loved you too much and didn't want to leave her son without a father. Now I don't care anymore. Gina has also grown up a long time ago, and his granddaughter is a bride. So the path to Alien is clear. I only ask you one thing. Wait at least a year after I leave before looking for your first love and daughter, whom you have never seen. Maintain this period of mourning in honor of all the good things that happened between us. And then do as your heart tells you. Forgive me for everything. Loving you, Kristen. Helen was shocked when she read the note. The story of tragic love, many years of deception, and difficult confession involuntarily touched her. The girl thought that probably Kristen's grandmother should have kept her secret forever. On the other hand, she understood that this was too cowardly. Of course, it's easier to judge from the outside than to find yourself in such a stalemate. And Helen couldn't imagine what she would have done in her grandmother's place. Would you immediately tell your legal husband that his friend still loves him and is waiting for him, together with their common daughter, or would you try by any means within your imagination to protect him from this literally stunning information? It became clear to Helen what Grandpa George wanted to talk to her about. Surely, since the one-year reprieve that Grandmother Kristen asked him for was coming to an end, he wanted to get advice on how to find his old lover. After all, a lot of time has passed, and it is possible that this alien has long since changed the common surname Smith. Her daughter, Helen's blood sister and her father's daughter, could also probably be married. Trying to distract myself from the unexpected information received, Helen put the papers back into the box, put it in the closet, and began reading the letters that Alien had sent to her grandfather. You never know what other details of the personal life of a loved one will be revealed. So alone, except for the cat, she fell into a light sleep. It was boring, and Helen started cleaning, although there was no particular need for this. The girl took out a bucket of dirty water to throw it into the far corner of the site and saw a car drive up to the gate. Helen's parents, who had finally returned from abroad, got out of the car and she was incredibly happy. Even though this meeting was tinged with bitterness, at least the worry for the parents receded from the heart. During the confused conversation, it turned out that they had arrived in a place where there was no connection or access to the internet. Michael and Anne, having reached civilization, received a sad message from their daughter just before the funeral of Grandfather George and hurried to return, but were still late. Helen was glad that she now had the support she needed so much. After hugs and tears, when everyone was already sitting at the table, the girl began to tell her dad and mom about the unusual find. To prove her words, the girl took out a box from the closet and together with her parents. She once again read aloud Grandma Kristen's handwritten confession, and then they studied the surviving letters. One of them contained a photo from a photo studio. It depicted two pretty girls, and there was clearly a kinship in the appearance of the beauties, but they looked more like sisters with a not very big age difference. However, the inscription on the back of the photograph indicated that this was the first love of Grandfather George and their common daughter Sophie. In beautiful handwriting it was written, "In memory of my beloved George from Alien and Sophie on her 16th birthday. We look forward to meeting you. 1981. Michael, forgetting about his respectability, even whistled, "Yes." To say that I'm surprised is to say nothing at all. How did Mom manage to keep all this a secret for so many years and not give away her knowledge? I can't even imagine. Anne, who had a wonderful relationship with her calm mother-in-law, contrary to all stereotypes and ideas about the peculiarities of the family way of life, was also perplexed. They had so many heart-to-heart conversations, but Kristen never said a word that somewhere far away her official husband had a beloved and illegitimate daughter. It was not easy to come to terms with such news. Anne asked, "Do you think we should find your sister and her mother, if she's still alive, of course, or let everything remain as it is?" The man himself did not know how to react to what was happening. Judging by what he learned from his daughter, the father wanted the secret of his youth to be known. On the other hand, is it ethical now to intrude into the fate of a stranger, but a woman related by blood? She appears to be about 50 years old now, and this same alien is most likely now approaching 70. A reminder of her difficult youth and the man she once loved so much but never got to see could be harmful to her health. In addition, as Kristen's grandmother wrote, after she sent back the letter marked the addressee has dropped out, they stopped coming at all. This could mean that Alien believed the lie or that she was desperate. However, alas, the most unfavorable events in the fate of the woman and her daughter could have happened, and said, as if voicing her thoughts out loud. But still, it seems to me that we should at least try to find my grandfather's daughter just to somehow rehabilitate him. After all, it's not Grandpa George's fault that everything turned out this way. I think it would be fair if the whole truth became known to Alien, and of course Sophie. Listen, Dad. The girl turned to Michael. How do you feel knowing that you have an older blood sister? Do you want to see her and chat? The man was confused and asked his daughter in response. And you, Helen, this is Sophie. Actually, Auntie, that's what you have to do. It turns out that it's interesting to meet her. Helen listened to herself and admitted, curious and a little scary. Opinions in the family were divided. Anne, after listening to her husband and daughter, said, "It seems to me that we should leave everything as it is. There is no need now to disturb something that has long been forgotten. More than half a century has passed. Maybe this alien is happy with another person. And hello, meet, so to speak, relatives." I think this is not entirely correct. A long conversation did not help find a compromise. In addition, all family members themselves were not sure of the correctness of their thoughts. As a result, the father went to bed in order to visit the place of George's final resting place in the morning. "Sorry, Dad, I'm late," Michael whispered, standing by a fresh mound covered with wreaths. "I never could have imagined that we wouldn't see each other again." The man put 4 scarlet carnations on the empty space and bowed his head, hiding his tears. After Michael, flowers were laid on George's grave by his daughter-in-law and granddaughter. Each of the grieving relatives realized that they were subconsciously waiting for a sign on how to deal with the information that had fallen on them. They didn't talk about it out loud, but Michael, Anne, and Helen were waiting for a revelation to descend on them. Perhaps it was naive and stupid, but I would really like to know what George himself wanted. No matter how much they hoped for a clue, they could not get it, and with a heavy heart, they returned to the apartment. We decided that Michael would live in the house for now, and that his wife and daughter would come to him in their free time. While Anne helped her husband pack at least the minimum necessary things, Helen hurried to the nearest store to buy some special food that was tastier for the yearning cat. The girl felt very sorry for the cat, who seemed to have suddenly lost his luster and lost his previously excellent appetite. After consulting with a serious-looking woman who was busily putting bags of wet food into the cart, Helen collected some gifts for her grandfather's pet and returned home, handing her dad a bag of food. "My dear, I'll ask. He is now a little capricious and may refuse food. Try to feed him from the palm of your hand. He usually starts eating as a sign of respect." And Tuis smiled at his daughter. "No, don't worry. I won't offend the tailed one. The days flew by. Just keep up with him." Helen, her mother, went to work, and in the evenings they talked about everything, as the girls were accustomed to from early childhood. Of course, they also talked about the secret that Grandma Kristen had been hiding for. We decided to gather our relatives. We sat together mentally, remembering various incidents from the past. Michael carefully tried to beg it from his great-uncle. "Stepan, can you tell us anything about Dad's youth?" The older man was happy to talk. George was always brave for any good cause, responsive and decisive. When he returned from the army, he went to the factory to get a job in the personnel department. As his mother later said, he heard from someone that young people from our city were sent to build villages and do household work. It was no longer a new thing then. Everyone in the country wanted to help. The people acted in unison. So George, after returning from military service, decided that he would be more useful there. I admit, I also wanted to go with him, but where should I go? In total at that time, I was 15 years old. George is 5 years older than me. In general, he went far. Fortunately, in the Army, he learned to drive a truck and received a license. He returned almost 5 years later. I brought saplings, as if as a souvenir of my long business trip. Of course, he has changed during this time. A naive boy left, but an almost grown man returned. Not because I'm related, but to be fair, I'll say that George definitely hasn't become any worse. I think she can find such Sophie now. His hands are golden and his character is worthy. When here at the automobile plant, they accepted him with open arms. Teetotal, hardworking, honest. What more could you ask for? Hungry for work, and so he will take off his last shirt and give it to someone else. Oh, and the men respected him. No matter what, he never refused. Well, women generally died for him, and he treated everyone very respectfully. Then he married Kristen. She worked at the post office, and somehow the company car broke down. and George was driving by and couldn't leave his fellow driver in trouble. That's how we met. We met briefly and signed, and see, my mother was even offended. It seemed like the holiday was squeezed. But since you, Gina, were born, George was happy. Here in the yard, relatives, neighbors, and colleagues staged a big party. Everyone was invited. It seemed like there weren't any delicacies on the table, but come on, that's not the main thing. It turns out that the atmosphere is much more important. Yes, there was a time when all the neighbors lived almost like relatives. Stefan Alexandrovich interrupted his memories to quench his thirst with a cool, tasty compote. And although he didn't manage to learn anything new that his son didn't know, it was still nice to hear kind words addressed to George. After only Michael, Anne, and Helen remained in the house, the female part of the family cleaned up, leaving the only man, apart from the cat, to dismantle the makeshift benches. Helen went to bed on her favorite cot, and she had a strange, incredibly realistic dream. The girl was not even afraid when she saw Grandfather George at his favorite apple tree. The man stood under the tree, gently stroking the bark and looking at his granddaughter, asking, "When the apples ripen, take a few and give them to those you know. Don't forget, Helen. Please don't forget." Grandfather George looked somewhere, relations of just trying to see what was happening behind his granddaughter's shoulder. Helen turned to see what or who interested the man, but it was empty. When the girl's gaze returned to the apple tree, Grandfather was no longer under the canopy. Outside the window, birds whistled and sang, tearing Helen out of the captivity of sleep, which left behind a vivid impression. There were no doubts left. Grandfather George conveyed the news, the very sign that was so missing to make the right decision. Of course, he made his desire clear. At his request, Chris and Helen must go on a trip in the fall so that her grandfather's longtime beloved and their common daughter will find out the whole truth. Shocked, Helen did not hide from her parents that she saw Grandfather George in a dream. Michael was even a little annoyed that the late father in his dreams visited not him, but his granddaughter. But wise Anne supported both her husband and daughter, so it was necessary. There, beyond reality, there are probably its own rules. In anticipation of the holiday, the whole family began preparing for Helen's upcoming trip. The girls' attempts to find Enya and Sophie on social networks were unsuccessful, although she patiently looked through hundreds of pages of users from various regions, and not just from that area. Helen planned to hit the road on the first day of her vacation, so as not to delay the resolution of the issue, which had already been postponed for many years by the will of Kristen's grandmother. The girls' parents, trying not to show their excitement, helped their daughter get ready. They reacted most responsibly to the upcoming transportation of apples, which Grandfather ordered to take with and placed a rectangular basket without a handle in a rather compact but roomy sports bag. She carefully placed the ripe fruits there, laying each layer with parchment paper on her husband's advice, and the main load, carefully covered with a towel, was packed. Helen added the minimum amount of things to her bag and hit the road. At the girl's request, her parents only accompanied her to the taxi, and although the daughter promised to call and report the results of the search, Anne and Michael were worried about their daughter. It is not at all a fact that the search expedition will be successful, and a meeting with a woman from George Ilyach's past could lead to completely unpredictable results. Thanks to a carefully thought-out route and the absence of any unforeseen circumstances, Helen easily reached the village from where Grandfather George had been receiving letters for so long, some of which he was able to read only after his wife's death. The local villages seemed to the girl to be quite a cozy settlement. The coming autumn had already touched the trees with gold and made the village especially picturesque. Private houses coexisted peacefully with apartment buildings, near which in some places there were small vegetable gardens and even greenhouses. The girl approached the house, the address of which was indicated on the envelope. An intercom was installed on the entrance door of a typical 5-story building, and Helen froze for a few seconds in indecision. She, although she was preparing mentally for the trip and even diligently prepared a short speech before the difficult explanation, suddenly became scared. Having overcome herself, Helen typed the number of the apartment she was interested in on the keyboard. Hearing a pleasant female voice from the speakers of the device, the girl asked, "He shuked. Hello, excuse me, please. Can I talk to Alien and her daughter Sophie? Come in." It came from the speaker, and the door opened. Helen was very surprised that the stranger, whose voice sounded from the speakers, did not ask her either her name or the purpose of meeting her. But there was no time to think. Breathing deeply to calm down, The girl went up to the second floor she needed, where a not-quite-old woman was already waiting for her behind the open door. Helen peered into her face, but in vain. I tried to recognize the stranger Sophie. How, given the fact that in the photograph she was captured at the height of her young 16 years and more than 3 decades had passed, it was unlikely that such drastic changes could have occurred. Outwardly, the woman was of a completely different type, and she looked at most about 40 years old, maybe a little bit older. Is it possible to accurately determine age by the appearance of modern women who take care of themselves, to which the stranger undoubtedly belonged? Helen greeted warmly. "Hello again. I was the one who bothered you. Tell me, please, how can I talk to Alien and Sophie?" The woman conducted the conversation freely, even in a brotherly way, as if she had known Helen for many years. Hello, if you're not joking. From what regions did you come? The question surprised Helen, but she answered honestly, although she did not understand why it mattered. The woman, hearing the name of the city, softened and invited her to enter the apartment, where she asked another strange question. "What are your grandfather's last names?" "My grandfather's last name on my father's side is Johnson, and on my mother's side, Adrian." The uttered phrase had a strange effect on the woman. She didn't ask any more questions. She began to fuss. Despite Helen's excuses, she led her into the kitchen through her plate of delicious rosy pies. She offered tea, coffee, homemade compote, and, holding out a glass of sweet drink to the guests, my mom's best friend was Sophie. She was like a caring nanny and an older sister to me. They survived together even when there was nothing special to eat except potatoes grown in a vacant lot. Meat was seen in occasionally. Alien, as she was planting, was so worried and afraid, and she hoped that one day they would look for her. I firmly told my mother not to tell anyone how to find her and her daughter, except for the man with the last name Johnson or his descendants. She was deeply in love with a certain George Johnson. The daughter is the fruit of their sinful and sweet love. Yes, that's right, George Johnson, my grandfather. Helen confirmed her comment. He passed away recently. Only after this did it become clear that his first love and their common daughter once lived here in your apartment at this very address. It's not Grandpa George's fault that he didn't find them earlier. This is how the circumstances developed. The landlady took a notebook from the closet, tore out a piece of paper, took a pen and flipped through the pages. I began to rewrite something, not forgetting to show cordiality. "You eat, drink. Perhaps you rushed here straight from the station. Refresh yourself. Otherwise, in order to meet Alien or daughter to meet again on the road, you will have to go to another city." They moved. We had to, although it was incredibly difficult for us to part. They became almost family. But after Aunt Alien encountered an acquaintance of the man who kept her as a slave, she was afraid to stay here. It's easier to get lost in a big city. Here you go. I texted you their address and Sophie's phone number to arrange a meeting. Knowing Aunt Alien, I am sure that she is still waiting for news about her beloved. But it's better if you and Sophie discuss the time and place of the meeting. Things aren't going well in their house. My daughter got an extremely nasty husband. When I saw him for the first time, can you imagine? I was even scared. It seems like a person is standing, smiling at you, and his eyes are contemptuous and angry. As my aunt later told me, he helped my daughter a lot in some way when she got a new job in the city, and she fell in love without noticing any of his shortcomings. When I saw it, it was too late, like a fly caught in a web. No matter how hard his aunt tries to get him away from his daughter, it just doesn't work. The woman fell silent. Apparently, she herself was worried about this situation, but she did not know how to help the woman whom she considered practically her sister. Helen tried not to look like she was from a hungry region, but she was also unable to refuse the tasty treat and belatedly remembered the rules of etiquette. "Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, Helen. My name is." "Thank you very much. Your pies are very tasty and the compote is simply wonderful." The woman was very cutely embarrassed. "Me? Come on. It's me who attacked with interrogation. My name is Alice. By the way, an alien taught me to cook. She is generally a master at cooking. Listen, Helen, do you have money for the trip? A taxi will cost more, but it will be faster than taking a train. Sorry, it's not much, but I can give you $50. Helen was deeply shocked by this proposal. Some Alice seems to be a completely modern young woman in her simple-minded and open behavior like good characters from old films that grandparents love to watch. Such a friendly attitude brought tears to Helen's eyes, and she hastened to calm Alice down. "Don't worry, my finances are fine. "Thank you, Alice. I'm very glad to meet you. Thank you for the treat. It's time to move on." Helen looked at the cost of a taxi to her destination in the app and sighed. "Yes, you're right. The price tag is something incredible. It doesn't matter. I'd love to take a ride on the train." Alice didn't let her guess go so easily. "Mate, now we'll look at the schedule of electric trains and passing trains on the internet. Maybe we'll even book a ticket right away. Why are you toiling around in the waiting room in vain? It's better to keep me company here." "It's true." Helen nodded, agreeing with Alice's wisdom. But the precaution turned out to be unnecessary. It turned out that given the time it takes to get to the station, you almost have to say goodbye to the hospitable woman. Almost leaving the apartment, Helen hesitated for a while. Opening the bag, she took out several large fragrant apples and handed them to Alice. "Here, these are apples from my grandfather's orchard. They are very tasty. I don't know how else to thank you for such a warm welcome." Alice was embarrassed again, but accepted the apples. "I can't resist such an incredible aroma and beauty. They are just like the picture. Say hi to Sophie. By the way, I'll probably, with your permission, warn her that you're going to see them. Let her somehow prepare an Oya. Otherwise, you never know, the blood pressure will jump, the heart will catch, or something else." Helen had no objections, and having said a warm goodbye to her new friend, the girl went to the station. Already with the sound of wheels, she sent her parents a detailed story about how the responsive Alice greeted her. She said that Alien and Sophie had moved, but she had their new address. The mother, who was clearly worried about her daughter, responded almost instantly and asked her to be careful on the road. The girl with a light heart promised to look around carefully and not get involved in any dubious adventures. Fortunately, the situation in the carriage was quite calm. Someone peered thoughtfully at the landscape outside the window, becoming less and less visible due to the approaching darkness. Some of the random fellow passengers were dozing, and Helen regretted that she could not, like most passengers in the carriage, immerse herself in communication with a smartphone. The charge level forced me to refrain from this luxury. Almost at the moment when the previous day crossed the border of night to remain forever in the past, Helen found herself in an ancient town standing on the... The girl thought with belated regret that she had not thought to book a hotel room in advance, because showing up at a stranger's apartment at such a late time was somehow completely awkward. The girl felt a little uneasy, but ordering herself not to be a coward, she quickly figured out how to get to the nearest hotel before her smartphone was completely discharged. Luck was with Helen. The administrator, smiling, even seemed to sincerely offer a small, but, in her words, a very cozy room. Soon Helen settled into her temporary housing and, having put her smartphone on charge, took a shower, had dinner, and lay down on the... Although it was late, the mattress was comfortable, no loud sounds penetrated the hotel room, and there was no sleep in either eye. Still, there is a meeting in the morning, for which she went on a trip, and the anxiety appeared again. The girl was thinking for the 100th time about what to say to the innocent victim of deception and how to apologize for her grandmother, and in general, in what style to conduct the conversation. After all, if, with the good-natured Alice, everything somehow turned out very naturally, this does not mean that communication with Ale and Sophie will be just as pleasant. Although she managed to fall asleep only in the morning, Helen woke up a few minutes before the alarm clock. Thanks to the girl's youth, the anxious night did not leave any noticeable marks on her appearance, and at 10, she decided to call Sophie. The woman answered almost instantly. It seemed as if she was expecting this call. It is quite likely that this was the case. After all, it's not very often that there are such meetings of relatives who had no idea about each other. Having quickly agreed to meet in one of the cafes located near the hotel, Sophie was the first to end the conversation. Surprisingly, the choice of a neutral public place for the meeting finally calmed Helen, for whom her recent acquaintance with Alice made the most pleasant and even encouraging impression. Well, such a sweet, kind woman simply cannot be friends and consider bad Sophie her family. This means that they are at least quite adequate. In addition, in a cafe surrounded by Sophie, she is unlikely to reach a violent expression of emotions, and there is less risk that Alien will get too nervous. The girl transferred the basket of apples into a spacious shopping bag, which she had prudently taken with her, and went to the meeting. As Helen approached the cafe, she noticed a slender woman on the porch of the establishment, in whose features it was quite possible to see the girl from the photograph from the letter. The girl was the first to say hello and introduce herself. Hey, hello, Sophie. I'm Helen Johnson. It turns out that my grandfather is your dad, the woman smiled. Very nice. I tell you quite sincerely, Alice told me that she had wonderful impressions of communication, and her opinion, as life has shown, must be trusted. But let's go. I'll introduce you to Mom, and we'll talk calmly. She's waiting for us inside. The acquaintance procedure turned out to be unusually calm. Alien behaved affably, but with poorly concealed interest, peering into the face of the granddaughter of her beloved man. To somehow break the prolonged silence, Helen handed the woman a bag. Here, these are apples from your grandfather's orchard. Alien looked up from studying her face and, looking inside the bag, gasped, "No." The woman carefully took out one fruit, looking at it, holding it tenderly, as if the apple were a living creature, and, without addressing either Helen or her daughter, she spoke quietly. It was noticeable that she wanted to express all the accumulated pain. George and I once dreamed that we would live in a house near which an apple tree would definitely grow. Not just like a fruit tree, but also seemingly in honor of me. What a pity that our dreams did not come true. When we met, I was only 15 years old. However, in my native land, all girls grow up early, mature for family life with a loved one. George was 9 years older. This age difference did not bother me at all. I deceived him. She said that they were already adults, and he couldn't even think that I was lying. We loved each other, forgetting about everything in the world. Probably as punishment for my lies and this sin, higher powers forced me to pay. Moreover, this terrible punishment also affects my daughter. The woman stroked the hand of her daughter sitting next to her, who blushed like boiled crayfish and fell silent. Helen, listening and without interrupting, "It's not at all that higher powers intervened in your life. Everything is much simpler and more offensive. Grandfather George, I received some of your letters only after the death of my wife, my grandmother." Helen told in detail everything she knew, and, not forgetting to mention her strange dream. "Someday, mate, so I came here so that you know everything. Both my parents and I thought it would be fair. I'm very sorry that your love had such a tragic story, but now nothing can be fixed." Alien held an apple in one hand, pressing it to her heart with her palm, and with the other she wiped away the tears that stubbornly rolled down her cheeks. Neither Sophie nor Helen knew what to say or how to calm the woman in this grief. The silence was like an unspoken minute of silence over George's death. "They haven't ordered drinks or food yet." Alien, as if waking up from a daze, suggested, "My dears, maybe we can walk along the street. I'm missing some air." Helen and Sophie agreed without hesitation, although the waiter, who did not wait for the order or at least a tip, simply looked unhappy. Nobody cared about him. 3 representatives of the fair sex reflected on the vicissitudes of fate and how outside interference destroys the most wonderful dreams. My daughter wanted to take the bag of apples, but Alien stopped her. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to part with these apples." Fortunately, the long handles made it possible to hang the bag on your shoulder, so it wasn't too heavy to carry. Alien asked Helen to tell everything she knew about her grandfather. What kind of work he did, what programs he liked to watch, what he liked to eat, and other everyday little things. The woman seemed to absorb the moments that had passed her by and smiled quietly. Perhaps she imagined that she herself had lived next to him all these years. The almost idyllic walk was interrupted by the ringtone of Sophie's mobile phone. The man who called shouted so loudly that even at a distance of the alley, Helen heard everything he said. "No, why the hell aren't you at home or at work? I was in a hurry on purpose, driving like crazy. And everything is like in a bad joke. Where are you going? Look, if I find out that you're cheating on me, I'll kill everyone, and you and your mother will fly out of my apartment like little kids." Stately Sophie, listening to the tirade, seemed to become smaller in stature. The lights in her eyes went out, and she answered briefly, "I'll be there now." Alien became noticeably agitated. It seems that the voice of the man who called was well known to her, and this man did not evoke the slightest positive emotions in her. Sophie began to say goodbye to Helen and then turned to her mother. "Listen, I'll run. Boris seems to be on edge already, and you can talk some more. You probably would like to talk about a lot of things." She hurried to leave, and from that moment, the casual conversation seemed to evaporate. The girl understood. The woman was terribly afraid for her daughter, who, as it was easy to understand, was in a relationship with a real tyrant. Soon Alien confirmed the guess of her young companion. "I have the impression that my bitter story of slavery and the power of a cruel, domineering man is now being continued by my daughter. She, however, got married, unlike me, quite officially, and even out of great love. That's how it seemed at least 15 years ago. I was so happy for my daughter. Boris always treated me, and even more so her, with respect. But as soon as he managed to persuade me to add my savings to a shared apartment, the relationship began to deteriorate instantly, gradually. One thing didn't suit him, then another. While I was huddled separately in a rented room, separate from my daughter and son-in-law, I had no idea how everything really was. Then, 5 years ago, I became seriously ill and went on long sick leave. In general, I had to ask Boris to come to their 2-room apartment. It seems that I felt that I had the moral right to do this, but, of course, I felt uneasy. Nothing. She hid her pride somewhere far away and asked to stay with her daughter and Boris. Then I saw that not everything was fine with them. There are always some complaints against my daughter, jealousy, hurtful words. In a milder version than before, the monster oppressed me, but every reproach against Sophie was a punishment for me. Recently, he began to accuse me of infertility, although he himself always repeated that children were not included in his life plans. I get the impression that he is provoking Sophie to divorce, and then when we exchange the apartment, we will get some kind of closet. I now clearly understand that Boris will share everything thoroughly down to every spoon, and that she and I are like 2 blades of grass that can be broken like spitting. I have no legal education. Sophie is also far from this. We cannot afford a good lawyer financially. Helen did not know how to console the unhappy woman who had never in her life been able to lean on a reliable man's shoulder. Instead of rushing into battle with all the troubles yourself, it seems that friendship with Alice's mother is the only bright spot in her life, even if it was not easy. But when no one tries to solve the problems, it is at least morally easier. As soon as I lost my permanent job and started baking at home, the fragile balance collapsed. Somehow everything went downhill. Although the standard of living even seemed to become higher, I can probably pay for my rented apartment again. But here's the irony of fate. I simply began to fear for my daughter's health. How afraid I am that Boris will start raising his hand against Sophie. And now there's something uneasy in my heart, as if some kind of trouble is approaching. Helen, I don't want to involve you in our family squabbles, but come to us, please. With you. Boris should moderate his ambition. He always does this in the presence of strangers, enthusiastically and even selflessly. Plays the role of an exemplary husband. If you ask our neighbors, everyone will probably unanimously say that my Sophie is incredibly lucky to have him. Helen immediately agreed to join us. Soon, after traveling a few bus stops and walking a little along the street, they found themselves inside the apartment. A muffled male voice was heard from one of the rooms. Now I'll teach you how to greet your husband, because in such fools as you need to put the thought into not wagging your tail in the absence of your legal spouse. Alien opened the door and saw Boris grab Sophie by the neck, lifting her off the floor. In a state of some kind of irrational anger, the woman took the bag of apples from her shoulder and hit her son-in-law on the head with it. The man, having let go of his victim, as if knocked down, collapsed on the floor, freezed from coughing. "Mom, what are you doing? What fly bit you? What if you broke Borea's skull?" Len slowly walked up to the sofa, sat down on it, and asked, "Sophie, nothing will happen to Boris. Better bring me some water with a sedative. My heart is starting to pound." Helen, meanwhile, looked closely at the man. He was clearly not too stunned and was already trying to get up. She looked dumbfounded. Boris was in no hurry to get up and, rubbing the back of his head, angrily collapsed on Alien and began to threaten. "Don't even think that this will be in vain. I'll go and film the beatings at the emergency room and put you, the senile old woman, behind bars." Sophie's hand shook as she handed the cup of medicine to her mother. The woman began to persuade Boris not to get excited, but he only became more unruly and uttered threats. "You'll go and eat gruel until you die, and then you'll die in a government house. And with your health, there's no point in being there." Unexpectedly, Boris's tirade was interrupted by Helen, who unwillingly, along with her grandfather and father, watched a variety of detective series and had, albeit small, but valuable experience in calming down even the most inappropriate office visitors and presumptuous suppliers. "First of all, I'll call the police here right now. I saw with my own eyes how you tried to harm Sophie. So Alien's actions may well qualify as causing grievous bodily harm in self-defense, but you may have much more serious problems. Believe me." Helen herself could not understand how she had the audacity to tell an adult man some numbers of articles of the criminal code emerging from the depths of the subconscious. Stress probably took its toll. She used some legal terms so boldly that Boris, under the furious pressure of the stranger, noticeably became shy, and then, carefully getting up, left the room, saying to his wife, "You're lucky that I have a strong head, otherwise I would have become a widow." When the man left, Helen sat down on the sofa next to Alien. The woman began to apologize to the guest. "Sorry, Helen, that this happened." The glow inside the girl was still shaking with anger. She managed to answer almost calmly, "There's nothing to apologize for at all." Sophie, standing near the wall, listened to what was happening in the kitchen, where Boris had gone, and then she rushed there, surprising her mother and Helen. The man was busy climbing through the cabinets in a fit of rage. He threw everything out of them right onto the floor, quietly called out to her son-in-law, "Boris, calm down. I hid my stash a long time ago. As soon as I noticed that the bills began to gradually disappear from there, you won't find anything in the kitchen, don't hope." The man, not knowing where he was stepping, crushed cereals and pasta, left the kitchen, almost knocked down Sophie, who was in his way, and soon slammed the door loudly. And Sophie began to clean up the consequences of the destruction caused by Boris, and Helen, without thinking for long, joined them. In response to the hostess's objections, the girl admitted, "Partly I feel a little guilty for everything that happened, so of course I won't stand aside." The mess in the kitchen was almost eliminated when Boris appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a man in a police uniform. Hello. Boris invited me to look into the circumstances of the beating. Alien sank into a chair, exhausted. Sophie looked angrily at her husband, who, on the contrary, was jubilant. While the women were cleaning up, he made a fuss and literally dragged a law enforcement officer into the apartment, greatly exaggerating the scale of the conflict, naturally, without telling you that before the ill-fated blow to the back of the head, he almost sent his wife to the next world. Helen was amazed at Boris's impudence and blurted out to eliminate the possibility of a dirty trick from this man with a rotten and petty soul. "Excuse me, can I see your ID?" The lieutenant presented the documents and began the interview. While Elena began to talk about what happened, Helen asked permission to call. The policeman did not interfere, and the girl hurried to dial her father's number. Michael listened to his daughter without interrupting, and then said, "In general, Victor will call you back now. He is well-versed in such matters. You put the phone on speakerphone, and I think he will be able to resolve this situation favorably and without unnecessary hassle." Helen's father was not mistaken. Boris's triumphant appearance melted as, during a telephone conversation, the policeman, seeing red prints on Sophie's neck, began to cast disapproving glances at the impudent man. The lawyer insisted that the lieutenant also accept a statement from the woman who had been attacked by her husband. And this speech had a wonderful effect. After the mutually amiable completion of telephone conversations, the man sternly asked Boris, "Are you still saying that your wife's mother hit you with a heavy bag for no reason at all?" The picture of this incident is completely different. You, Boris, practically made a false call and even lied. This case, unfortunately, is not subject to jurisdiction, but it is quite possible to run into a fine. Now I will write everything down as it happened and warn you right away. You don't need to deceive me anymore. When Alien showed her terrible remedy, which she applied to her son-in-law, the policeman could hardly contain his smile and involuntarily admired the large, elegant apples. Boris, having read and signed the document drawn up, showered curses and abuse on his wife, her mother, and their young intercessor who had come from nowhere. The district police officer reprimanded the man, and he left the apartment in a rage. The policeman, turning to Sophie, said, "I will advise you simply as a human being. Do not tolerate such an attitude. Further, as experience shows, similar marriages do not lead to anything good. It's not too late to get a divorce." Sophie thanked the district police officer. "Thank you for your informal approach. We handled the situation fairly." Alien put almost half of the apples Helen had brought in a bag to the district police officer and handed it over with the words, "Please accept it as a token of gratitude. I am very embarrassed that my intemperance caused my son-in-law to disturb you." The district police officer shrugged his shoulders, saying that's the job. And then, as if having thrown off the plaque, he formally asked with admiration in his voice, "How did you manage to grow such beautiful apples? At my parents' dacha this year, almost the entire harvest was destroyed by hail at the ovary stage. What was not beaten rotted during the frost. Alien smile. I myself didn't expect to admire such apples. This is a famous variety. The defender generously brought these apples to us from another region, where a seedling was delivered many years ago from a southern country by a very good person, despite the difference in climate. The tree has taken root. The police officer thanked him again for the apples, dictated his phone number just in case, and saying goodbye, left the apartment. Despite the successful solution to the problem, Boris's petty revenge in the form of calling the police turned out to be a rather exhausting event for everyone, Pale jokingly stating, "That's it, we've had enough cleaning for today. Where has this been seen? A girl came to visit us, and we gave her a broom and dustpan. That's it, girls, let's set the table in my room. With this hoard, we will be completely starved." Helen was removed from preparing for the feast, and she hurried to call her dad to report that the conversation with the lawyer had helped her get out of a very difficult situation. Michael and Anne, who knew a noticeably softened version of events from her husband, were relieved when their daughter reported this information. Still, even at 24 years old, Helen remained for her parents the same beloved little girl whom they wanted to protect, to cover with their care like a dome, impenetrable to all kinds of evil. As Alice said, Anna turned out to be an incredibly skilled craftswoman when it comes to food. Helen enjoyed trying the seemingly simple but extremely tasty bassifaye. After tea with delicious and homemade sweets, Sophie asked her guest, "Can we arrange a video conference on Skype with your dad? I would like to get to know my half-brother at least in this remote way." Helen admitted, "My parents also asked me about this, but I didn't know how to offer it. Is it convenient?" Alien threw out her hands. His daughter, "My clever girl, what a good idea you came up with. Come on quickly, set everything up." Just a few minutes later, an image of Michael appeared on the laptop screen. First of all, the man began to ask Alien for forgiveness. "It's difficult for me to talk about this, but the happiness of my parents' family and my, in fact, carefree childhood were actually built on the foundation of your misfortunes. Most likely, if letters from you had fallen into the hands of your father earlier, he would probably have found a way to help you. However, my mother was most likely afraid that he would give up everything and ask for a divorce. And he will go to you and his daughter, whom he never had the chance to meet. I sincerely apologize to you, Sophie. I want you to know that you can always count on me. Helen will leave you my phone number and other contacts. Contact us anytime you need it." Helen sat with the hospitable hostesses until the evening, listening and talking about herself and her family. Despite the rather strange circumstances of meeting, no one felt the slightest awkwardness. "I didn't even think that I would suddenly have such a wonderful niece." Alien, named Sophie for Helen, saw in her a subtle, almost imperceptible resemblance to George. Similar facial features, dimples, the funny habit of wrinkling your nose and frowning when you smile. For so many years, the woman remembered the only man she loved desperately, and then, as if out of habit, she hoped to meet. And now there is no more chance to see each other. It was incredibly sad, and there was only one consolation. George did not forget her and did not betray her. I naively believed what she said then. That's the only thing she could reproach him for, even if she wanted to. Countless times, Alien imagined that she had handled that fateful conversation differently. If only then, more than half a century ago, she had only found the courage to tell her beloved that her father was threatening to kill him if she had offered to run away. However, George would probably have found a more correct way to solve the problem. If only she had honestly told him everything many years ago. Most likely they would now be together as they dreamed. Maybe for Sophie, who would have felt the care and support of her father in her personal life, everything would have turned out much more successfully. Everything would have been much better. And she would not have gotten involved with this slippery, nasty Boris. They incredibly regretted that she was unable to protect her fragile love. But she couldn't blame the woman who became George's legal wife for this. In the end, it was she, even under pressure, who rejected her loved one. This means there is no point in looking for someone to blame on the side. The day turned out to be long, eventful, and after a hearty meal and long conversations, those sitting at the table began to yawn, either one by one or all at the same time. Helen flatly refused to be escorted to the hotel. "Don't worry, please. The taxi will take me directly to the place, so there will be no difficulties. As soon as I'm in my room, I'll let you know right away." Sophie said goodbye to Helen as a close relative, with whom they share not only blood ties but also friendship, before getting into taxi. The girl waved to her new acquaintances for a long time, looking out of the window, and did not notice how Boris, who was holding a grudge, was approaching her from a bench installed at the next entrance. The man believed that it was this strange young upstart, whom he saw today, for the first time in his life, who was to blame for the unsuccessful day. Just think, he grabbed it lightly, but it hurt her why she left the house and didn't even think to inform him. It is clear that the matter is unclean. He, as a husband, had every right to teach her how a decent woman should behave. And this little girl, instead of apologizing, began to argue with him, explaining that she had not done anything wrong, so he cut off her oxygen, a little to discourage her. And then, as luck would have it, the evil fury came at the wrong time and hit him on the head with all. Boris touched the back of his head, feeling a painful lump, and continued to think about the insult that he had to endure. Surely everything would not have turned out at all joyfully for the wife and her foolish mother, if not for an unfamiliar face. The devil dared her to end up in their apartment today. The man was sure that without the support of this educated trash, women would not have dared to blather in his direction. Moreover, he would have been able, most likely would have been able to convince the district police officer that the women were conspiring against him. But this young sheep turned out to have a trump card after the intervention of an obviously competent lawyer who knew all the laws. He, Boris, had to leave the apartment as a beggar, although he also has the right to square meters. However, the battle for them is still ahead. In the meantime, we need to deal with these insolent women. Of course, he's now breaking in on his wife and her mother. It's no use. They were probably locked with all the locks and a chain. But to lie in wait and teach a lesson, that would be right. It was for this reason that Boris sat on the bench, sort of like a predator in ambush, waiting for Sophie to see when the defenseless sheep leaves the herd and finds itself in his power. The man even laughed and was glad that he had found such a comparison. But the wait dragged on. The autumn evening, gentle and merciless, had already begun to hint that the planned hunt would not take place. Boris was trembling, either from suppressed rage or from hunger and cold, and was about to leave. But then the entrance door opened and a girl jumped out into the street. Boris's joy was somewhat premature because the impudent sheep climbed into the taxi. But this only provoked the man. The chase is the chase. Luckily, the cars are nearby. In the meantime, heavy traffic in the city will not allow the future victim to disappear from view. Helen had already grabbed the door handle to the hotel, dreaming of quickly collapsing on the bed and getting some sleep. But she heard a voice behind her. The girl automatically turned around and lost precious fractions of a second. Boris, whose voice she recognized very well, was rapidly approaching her. Helen turned away and, trying to quickly get into the hotel, out of fear began to push the doors in the wrong direction. When finally salvation was close, the man grabbed her by the waist, turned her to face him, and began to threaten her in a falsely affectionate tone. "Where were you in such a hurry? Explain to me, why the hell are you interfering in my family life? Why are you silent, sheep? Who asked you to intervene?" The girl prepared to scream loudly and wondered how to free herself. But I didn't have to look for salvation on my own. She could not see how a district police officer, who was already in civilian clothes, appeared from the slightly open door behind her, but she was incredibly happy when she heard, "Boris, you are completely wrong now. Let the girl go." There were steely notes in the policeman's voice, and Boris instantly loosened his grip and made excuses to the district police officer. "I just came to talk." Then I thought of inviting him for a walk and showing him the city. The policeman, leaving the hotel, asked, "Helen, if you don't mind, wait for me in the foyer. I need to agree on something with Boris." Helen sat down in a comfortable chair. A few minutes later, a local police officer sat down next to him and admitted, I actually came to see you. My parents immediately lost peace when they saw the apples. They asked me to come to an agreement with you about the cuttings. His father wants to vaccinate him and try to grow such beauty too. And I can't count how many times the markets have cheated with varieties. The picture shows one thing, but what emerges is something completely different. So I came here to the hotel. And as it turns out, it's not in vain. The girl smiled. She liked this young and somehow very correct and principled policeman. In gratitude for her salvation, she promised him to send as many Sherenkov as she wanted when she got to her grandfather 2 houses away. They exchanged contacts and said goodbye. The man did not want to part with the charming girl, but he could no longer find any reason to stay close to her. It seems that it was not in vain that Grandfather George sent me to look for Sophie in my dreams. He also advised me to take apples with me. Events after meeting the relatives began to develop with frightening speed. Sophie divorced Boris, and after exchanging the apartment, they moved at the invitation of Michael to his father's house. The man suggested from the bottom of his heart, "Since I am aware of my mother's guilt, let this house be at least a small compensation for all your suffering," and sat for a long time by the apple tree, carefully grown by his loved one, stroking it like a living creature. And Helen, who was always a welcome guest, was glad that the elderly woman, although belatedly, had found peace. In the personal life of the granddaughter, the glossy fruits of the airport also played an important role. Correspondence and regular telephone conversations with Sergio, that policeman, helped to find out that their sympathy is mutual and does not weaken over time, but even becomes stronger. Soon the lieutenant moved to the city to live with his girlfriend, explaining, "Well, our police required everywhere, and if necessary, I can master another profession." Sophie also found her personal happiness when she met a man in a new city. Ana, stroking the apple tree, quietly whispered, "Thank you, George. I know for sure that it was you who helped arrange everything so successfully."